With Paulus's second offensive in the city crushing his defences, on the 28th of September 1942, Chuikov ordered Smiket-Vorov, commander of the 193rd Rifle Division, to ferry his last two regiments across the Volga. This would not be an easy task. The city was burning, lit by an enormous glow. Neither the moon nor the stars could be seen, only the bright lights of the tracer bullets rising up in the sky, looking like some sort of strange fan made by multicoloured fireflies. As they crossed the Volga, flares went up and the Germans opened fire. Artillery and night bombers pounded them, causing both confusion and losses, disrupting their landing, with some units ending up in the wrong places. Their signals battalion was sunk, and their communications equipment went down with it. Nonetheless, the bulk of the division had arrived and regrouped themselves in the Red October factory. Some of the men shared their emergency rations with the starving parents and children that huddled in the basement. Then, Smiket-Vorov sent his soldiers to reinforce the defences of the Red October and Barricade villages, swapping his units with Popov's 23rd Tank Corps, which went into reserve defensive positions at the Red October factory. And, although not specifically stated in the sources I have, it also appears that Batiuk shifted the 1045th Regiment northwards to the Meat Combine area, and then redeployed the 1043rd Regiment south to the Dolgi Ravine. As these movements occurred, on the other side of the wire, Seydlitz ordered a resumption of his attack to recommence at dawn. Yenika's 389th Infantry Division was to continue its advance, with the 544th Regiment ordered straight down the Vishny via Balka, aiming at the Barricade village, while the 545th and 546th Regiments would directly assault the Soviet defences around the Orlovka salient. Lenski ordered his two Kampfgruppen to strike into the northwestern parts of the Red October and Barricade villages. But because the 100th Jaeger Division hadn't kept up with the tanks, the flank of the 24th Panzer Division was still exposed. Therefore, the 100th Jaeger Division was ordered to keep the pressure on the 95th Rifle Division, but then would shift its forces northwards to cover the flank of the Panzer Division. Thus, at dawn on the 28th, the attack began. Chuikov, though, called for a non-stop artillery and mortar bombardment on Mamayev Kurgan and ordered Gorishny's 95th Rifle Division to retake the crest. But it was the Germans who struck first, with 100th Jaeger Division advancing about 800 metres to the railway line northwest of the hill. The Croatian 1st Battalion, supported by a battalion from the 516th Regiment which had moved up to reinforce it, wrestled with the Soviet 90th and 1045th Regiments and managed to take the western part of the Meat Combine. The 1st Jaeger Battalion from Kampfgruppe Moor captured the western section of the shooting range village, while the Croatian 2nd Battalion took the heights overlooking the Bani Ravine and the southern part of the Red October village. At this point, though, they were halted by heavy fire from Gorishny's two regiments, which were reinforced by a few tanks from the 137th Tank Brigade, as well as bits and pieces from the 269th NKVD Regiment. The Soviets had also converted the nearby concrete factory into a strongpoint, and the machine gun fire from there kept the German Jaegers pinned. To the south, the 1047th and 1043rd Regiments also held against the 518th and 517th Regiments in the areas of the Dolgi and Krutoy ravines. Further north, Luftwaffe airstrikes pounded the built-up areas ahead of 24th Panzer Division and hit the Barricade factory. Then, at 06:15 hours, Kampfgruppe Edelsheim's reconnaissance parties scouted into the lower Red October village to find weak points in the Soviet defences. Once this action was complete, Edelsheim pushed northeast, getting shot at from the nearby large apartment blocks. There, small groups of riflemen from the 112th Rifle Division, reinforced by the remnants of the 38th and 9th Motorized Rifle Brigades, sniped away, killing not just some of the Germans, but also their Hiwis. The Grenadiers were persistent though, sweeping through the gardens and the huts, receiving more fire from other small groups protecting the Red October village. Meanwhile, to the north, the 544th Regiment of Yenika's 389th Infantry Division also advanced eastward along the Vishny via Balka, driving the Soviet defenders into the western end of the upper barricadey village. Clearly, the stragglers of these decimated Soviet units had no chance of stopping the Germans, especially after Edelsheim got level with Camp Group Winterfeld, because at that point the whole division rolled northwards together. During this advance, Camp Group Winterfeld split into two subgroups, allowing it to drive into the cemetery and into the upper barricadey village. Several Soviet units were overrun and forced back by this assault, as the 1st Battalion of the newly arrived 895th Rifle Regiment was shattered by Winterfeld's spearhead. During this desperate fighting, one of the Soviet soldiers, a man called Panikarkar, ran out of ammunition, so he prepared to throw a Molotov cocktail at a panzer. It's not clear exactly what happened next. Either, as he held the bottle up above his head, the liquid leaked onto him, so he basically poured it on himself, or a German bullet had smashed into the bottle. Either way, the contents of the bottle poured onto him and he ignited. Panikarkar, now on fire, then ran at the enemy and smashed a second bottle on the engine grill of a panzer, engulfing both the tank and himself in a fireball. But, despite the sacrifice of some of the Soviet soldiers, the advance rolled on under the heat of the sun, with Edelsheim combing through the huts towards the north. As the day drew to a close, Edelsheim reached the division's objective, the first of the two gullies west of Skulpchiny Park. By nightfall then, 24th Panzer Division had advanced 6 kilometers in the past 2 days and had taken 280 prisoners and destroyed or captured a bunch of equipment, including 4 mine dogs, for the loss of 25 men killed and 164 wounded. The cost for the 62nd Army was high. Popov's 23rd Tank Corps had just 17 tanks left, having lost 626 men dead or wounded, while Batyuk's 284th Rifle Division lost 300 men. Grishny's 95th Rifle Division was also down to a handful of men at this point, so clearly the Soviet units were in dire shape. However, beaten though they were, Zaylitz's corps had not completely destroyed them, and now the units of the 24th Panzer Division's exposed right flank were a cause for concern. With less than 1,000 frontline troops in Edelsheim's Kampfgruppe, there was no way he could continue to advance northwards whilst leaving the Soviets unchecked. It therefore became obvious that unless the 100th Jaeger Division could move northwards and occupy Hill 107.5, Edelsheim's forces would be vulnerable to counterattacks from the west. Therefore, the 100th Jaeger Division was ordered to shift its regiments northwards overnight and at the same time to keep the pressure on the 95th Rifle Division. First as 1st Battalion from Weber's 54th Jaeger Regiment was pulled out of the line and sent around to the area northwest of the shooting range village, along with the Croatian 1st Battalion and the 2nd Battalion of the 227th Jaeger Regiment, which were also redeployed to the left flank. These 3 battalions were then formed into Kampfgruppe Pavicic. Kampfgruppe Moor was still in the gap between the Red October and shooting range villages, with the Croatian 2nd Battalion and the 227th Regiment's 1st Battalion. And Kampfgruppe Weber, which was basically the 2nd Battalion of the 54th Regiment, now moved north to the water cisterns area. It also appears that the 516th Regiment moved north to join Weber on the hill as well. And because of these moves, the 21st Panzer Grenadier Regiment of Kampfgruppe Edelsheim was relieved and now moved north to reinforce the main force. At the same time, Jenica left some forces opposite the western end of the barricadey village, but redeployed the bulk of his division northward towards the crossings over the Mechetka River. From here, he could mount another attack to the north. Paulus had also, by this point, withdrawn all 3 regiments of Pfeiffer's 94th Infantry Division from the city centre and was sending them northwards to assist 24th Panzer and 389th Infantry Divisions in reducing the Orlovka salient. September 28th. Our regiment and the whole division are today celebrating victory. Together with our tank crews, we have taken the southern part of the city and reached the Volga. We paid dearly for our victory. In 3 weeks, we have occupied about 5.5 square miles. The commander has congratulated us on our victory. This, of course, left Hartmann's 71st Infantry Division to deal with the Soviets in central Stalingrad, which was not good, since only one of Hartmann's 7 battalions was rated weak, with all the others listed as exhausted. 94th Infantry Division also had all 7 of its infantry battalions listed as weak as well. Paulus was also informed by both Lenski and Zanner when he visited their headquarters this day that their fighting efficiency was reduced as a result of the losses they'd suffered and the lack of replacements that they had received for their divisions. Arrival at 100th Jaeger Division's HQ, where the division commander complains about the weakening of the infantry's fighting strength. The division lost almost 500 men yesterday. But, weakened though they were, the Germans still held the initiative, and it was in the north that the most serious threat to Churikov's army now lay. Soviet forces in the Orlovka salient were in trouble as Yenika's 389th Infantry Division prepared to advance northeastward. At the same time that Huber's 14th Panzer Corps were also hopefully going to strike south. This attack, if successful, would cut off Soviet forces in the salient, where they would be destroyed. This was something Churikov couldn't ignore, and to counter the Germans, Churikov decided to form a defensive line to stop Yenica in his tracks. Except he had practically nothing to spare to form this line. So, with no other choice, he pulled 2 battalions out of the line from Group Gorokov and ordered them to hold the Mechetka River and the approaches to Orlovka. Clearly, this force wouldn't hold for very long. And you'd think that since Paulus was committed to cutting off the Orlovka salient, he would shift his only panzer division in the area to the north in order to guarantee that the salient would be cut off as speedily as possible. You'd think he'd put the 389th Infantry Division in the barricaded district to face the Soviet forces there, relieve the 24th Panzer Division, and then move that northwards to the salient. But you would be wrong to think that. Instead, Paulus promised to relieve Lenski's right wing with the 276th Infantry Regiment on the 30th of September. Yes, not the next day, but the day after. And he ordered Seydlitz to push northwards into the Red October village and the factory there with the 100th Jaeger Division and 295th Infantry Divisions. This would obviously shorten 24th Panzer Division's front and allow them to move northwards, but it wouldn't relieve the whole division. Worse, there was no guarantee that Seydlitz could actually do this, since at the same time they were to try and clear Soviet forces off the eastern slopes of Mamiev Kurgan and out of the Dolgi and Krutori ravines. So basically, Paulus was diluting his forces and spreading them out over a wide area rather than concentrating them at one point, as is usually the German tactic. But okay, fine. So long as Seydlitz and the 276th Infantry Regiment relieve part of 24th Panzer Division, then that part can move northwards towards the Orlovka salient. Right? Well, yes. For the next day, Paulus ordered the 24th Panzer Division to attack towards the mountain village. So the salient was now in his sights, rather than the city proper. But would this work? Did Paulus have the strength to strike north and cut off the Orlovka salient? Not if the Soviets had anything to do with it. All these shifts and reorientations are an indication that the Germans were having to juggle their forces to keep their offensive going. There simply wasn't enough German manpower to go around. This was noticed on the Soviet side, with Chuikov himself commenting that their opponent was weakening. We felt that the enemy attacks were losing their punch. They were uncoordinated, not as rapid and well organised as they had been. Enemy battalions supported by tanks were thrown into battle at different points and not very confidently. This enabled us to mass our fires and beat off all attacks in turn and then go over to the counter-attack ourselves. Still, Chuikov's remaining forces were barely hanging on, and the rapidly deteriorating situation, plus the threat of being thrown back across the Volga, seems to have spurred Chuikov to desperate measures. At first, Chuikov ordered his army and the civilians to construct anti-tank minefields and erect anti-infantry obstacles. But then he also said, "It must be explained to every soldier that the army is fighting on its last line of defence. There can be no further retreat. It is the duty of every soldier and commander to defend his trench, his position, not a step back. The enemy must be wiped out, whatever happens." In his The Beginning of the Road, Chuikov's order stops here, which is convenient since he left out the last bit. Glance, though, provides the final part of Chuikov's order. "Shoot soldiers and commanders who willfully abandon their foxholes and positions on the spot as enemies of the fatherland. Chuikov, Gorov, Krylov." It's no wonder he left this bit out. We can't have the Soviet peoples knowing about Order number 227, can we? However, what I find interesting is that on the same page, and the next one, Chuikov starts talking about the commissars and the party comrades who were fighting in the city, telling of their heroic deeds and how much they were heroes. Considering that he's just mentioned this order and had neglected to write the final sentence of it, the one calling for the execution of cowards, is he providing a hint to historians about what was happening? Was he praising the actions of the commissars in a tongue-in-cheek way? For example, he says, "How could one ever forget the late V.A. Malishev, representative of the Council of People's Commissars and the later deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR. In the bitterest days of the fighting in Stalingrad, in the tractor factory, he was there carrying out the instructions of the party and the government." Oh, and what instructions were they, exactly? Order 227, perhaps? Was Chuikov naming Malishev as one of the guys who carried out the execution of soldiers? And what about when Chuikov wrote this? "I cannot but remember the leaders of the political organizations, such communists as Brigade Commissar Vasiliev, Colonels Vavlivlov, Chernishev and Vasenka, Lieutenant Colonels Kachenka and Ovcharyenko, and others." Is he listing the guilty commissars? The ones that executed the men? Is that what's happening here? Are we correct to read between the lines? The party's continuous political work produced a high level of morale among the men defending the city and increased the fighting efficiency of every unit. Yeah, I'm sure singing political songs and saying party slogans boosted the morale of the troops, and this had absolutely nothing to do with the order to shoot people if they abandoned their posts, which Chuikov had just given, reinforced by the not one step back order. Yeah. It also seems that Order number 227 had other unforeseen consequences as well. That night, I was sitting in the trench again when a girl came down into the trench looking for water, but I didn't have any water either. The only water was in the casing of the machine gun. I remember that I advised her to go down to the Volga, but she didn't manage to reach it and came back with tears in her eyes. The girl said that a blocking detachment had refused to let her through to the Volga. Desperate times, perhaps, called for desperate measures. However, there was some good news for Chuikov. In fact, great news for Chuikov, as the 62nd Army was about to receive substantial reinforcements. The Stavka now sent the 159th Fortified Region, including 12 machine gun artillery battalions, to the Stalingrad region, and 2 Guards Rifle Divisions were also dispatched from 4th Tank and 1st Guards armies, plus the 308th Rifle Division from the 21st Army, and all of these were now marching towards Stalingrad. In addition, the 87th and 315th Rifle Divisions were ordered from the reserves to be deployed to Stalingrad Front's rear. And the 84th and 90th Tank Brigades were also transferred to Southeastern Front's control, as well as the 93rd, 96th and 97th Rifle Brigades, which were to form the Southeastern Front's new 7th Tank Corps. So, a ton of reinforcements were now on their way to Churikov. Plus, the Stavka finally took measures to end the confused command situation in the region. As it currently stood, the Southeastern Front commanded the Stalingrad area, and the Stalingrad Front commanded the area north of the city. There was also some overlap here as well, with Yeremenko being in overall charge of both fronts and Gordov acting as his subordinate. This was ridiculous. So now the Southeastern Front was renamed the Stalingrad Front, with Yeremenko taking charge of the 28th, 51st, 57th, 62nd and 64th Armies, and Rokossovsky would take command of the new Don Front, which would consist of the 1st Guards, 4th Tank, 21st, 24th, 63rd and 66th Armies. Gordov was sent to the Stavka Reserve. And because the Soviet Air Force had failed utterly, now only really operating at night due to German air superiority, General Pavel Stepanov, commander of the 16th Air Army, was replaced by Stepan Rudenko. These were massive changes to the Soviet order of battle all at once, and this was no minor revision. Although this change later caused considerable confusion among historians, it was not an idle shift in terminology. It recognised that Yeremenko's headquarters was now responsible for the defence of the city. For its part, Rokossovsky's new Don Front would prepare for future offensive operations along the Don River and in the Kotlebane region northwest of the city. It also had a major effect on the fighting in the city, as Isayev notes. Offensive tasks were to be entrusted to Rokossovsky. Naturally, defensive tasks remained in Yeremenko's hands. Churikov went from the energetic flinging of reserves into the fighting to a strategy of stubborn resistance. Now the army commander would assign predominantly defensive missions. This is a crucial development because it affects what we talked about way back in part 2 of episode 19. Yes, that was a long time ago, so let me just quickly refresh your memory of this. In Zhukov's memoirs and in many of the books, it is claimed that Zhukov and Vasilevsky suggested to Stalin on the 13th of September 1942 that a counter-offensive could be mounted on the flanks where the Romanian armies were. We clearly saw that the main blows must be struck at the flanks of the Stalingrad concentration, which was covered by Romanian troops. I pointed out that this couldn't have happened on the 13th of September because the Romanians weren't on the Don yet. Zhukov couldn't have thought up the idea of attacking the Romanian army at that time if the Romanian army hadn't even arrived. I also pointed out that Zhukov thought they'd have enough forces to start the operation in 45 days' time, and, doing some quick maths, this would place the start date in late October rather than mid-November as it was in reality. In addition, Anton Jolly, Glantz and Isayev say that neither Zhukov nor Vasilevsky visited the Kremlin in the mid-September period, and that it was only later, from the 27th, that they were with Stalin. I said that all this suggested that they only came up with the idea for the plan later. Well, now, unlike the 13th of September, the Romanians had 4 or 5 divisions along the Don, with more moving up. They had also relieved 2 German divisions and were also beginning to relieve some of the Italian divisions as well. As part of the usual narrative, it is said that Zhukov and Vasilevsky presented Stalin with a plan about a possible counterattack on the 12th. But if we shift this back to the 28th, it makes more sense, because now Stalin considered whether Gordov should lead one of the armies in this counterattack. Zhukov and Vasilevsky thought that Gordov didn't get along with his subordinates, and so Gordov should be replaced. Instead, Zhukov recommended Konstantin Rokossovsky for the job, which Stalin accepted, then changed the names of the fronts at Stalingrad to reflect this new setup. Before leaving, both Vasilevsky and Zhukov signed a map showing the plan for the counter-offensive. Stalin added the word "approved", then he wrote his own signature. Now, I'm not sure on the timing of this, but it appears that Rokossovsky was in the Don area in mid to late September helping Zhukov out, and it was he who explained to Zhukov that the Don front, previously the Stalingrad front, lacked the strength needed to both thwart German operations or mount any decent counter-offensive. So a reorganisation of the Don front began from the 28th onwards. Kravchenko's 4th Tank Corps was withdrawn to the front's reserve and refitted, and 7 new rifle divisions were sent from the 10th Reserve Army near Moscow to the Don front. For this reason, it therefore makes sense for the plan to have been conceived in late September rather than on the 12th. Otherwise, why wait so long before making the changes you decided on earlier? The original concept for the Uranus plan was, therefore, formulated on or around the 28th, which was when Rokossovsky, Malinin, Zhukov and Vasilevsky visited the Kremlin, admittedly not all at the same time, but just a few hours apart. Then, with the basic outline of the plan in mind, Stalin acted to put the correct commander in charge of it, which is why Gordov was replaced by Rokossovsky, whom he had just called to the Kremlin as well. Now, this is not to say that the full plan of Operation Uranus was fully fleshed out at this time. In fact, there was a period of almost 2 months before Operation Uranus began, and the plan went through numerous changes, which we'll come back to in the future. What it does say is that Zhukov got the date wrong, and arguably put it earlier than it was in reality, either simply because it was a mistake, or because he wanted to take the limelight from another general. Again, we'll come back to discuss this idea in the future. But if we say that they came up with the plan on or around the 28th of September 1942, and that Zhukov was right in his prediction that they'd be ready to strike in about 45 days' time, this would bring the date to about the 12th of November, just days before the start of Operation Uranus. So really, all the evidence suggests that this was the time that the idea for a major offensive against the Axis-Don front was conceived. Rather than just relentlessly butting their heads against the brick wall that was the German positions in the Kotlebane region, Soviet eyes shifted towards the Romanian area on the Don. But this was just an idea, and we're a long way off from the start date of this counter-offensive, and there was a lot of planning still to do. In the meantime then, the Soviets had to keep the Germans tied down in the Stalingrad area, meaning that Chuikov had to hold on for at least another 45 days. Well, as difficult a task as this may have seemed at the time, it was a possibility, especially since Paulus's second offensive inside the city of Stalingrad had just come to a halt. At 0430 hours on the 29th of September 1942, under the hail of artillery shells, the 883rd and 895th Regiments of the 193rd Rifle Division, with tanks, attacked Edelsheim's 26th Grenadier Regiment. Jason D. Mark describes the scene. The Grenadiers had established their positions in overgrown vegetable patches, behind paling fences, and in half-demolished wooden huts, but because the line ran through gardens and huts, there was no clear field of fire. Machine guns hammered and beads of tracers smashed into the huts standing opposite or splashed off remnants of crumbling masonry chimneys. Fires flared and cast a ghastly orange light over the battlefield. The Russians infiltrated the German line and killed several men in their foxholes. The thump of exploding grenades and hoarse Russian voices rang out, and the deep rumbling of diesel engines caused the air to vibrate. Only the intervention of Kampfgruppe Winterfeld restored order, as a swift counterattack pushed the Soviets back. But the toll was high. One German platoon leader was dead, another 38 men were also killed, 94 were wounded, and 8 men were missing after the attack. And what's interesting is that this Soviet attack only went in because Shmekatorov had misinterpreted Churykov's orders. Churyakov had wanted him to defend the area, but the divisional commander mistakenly believed that this meant he had to retake the parts of the assigned area that had already fallen into German hands. This misinterpretation put significant pressure on Lenski's flank. But there was some good news for 24th Panzer Division. Part of Kampfgruppe Idelsheim was relieved by the 276th Regiment of 94th Infantry Division, allowing it to regroup and prepare for another attack in the coming days. Although its arrival was most welcome, 276th Regiment fielded 2 weak infantry battalions with a total trench strength of only 160 men. Hull's account confirms this and also describes the landscape when they arrived at the front. In front of us now, there was another chimney graveyard with a few partially destroyed huts. It must have been the Red October housing estate. Massive airstrikes pounded the Soviet positions prior to a renewed assault on the Orlovka salient. From the north, Huber sent in 3 companies west of Hill 134.5, aiming for Orlovka itself, but were quickly stopped by the 1st Battalion of the 115th Rifle Brigade, reinforced by some policemen from the 282nd NKVD Rifle Regiment. But this was just the beginning. Later in the morning, the 1st Battalion of the 79th Panzer Grenadier Regiment was moved from the Renock area and sent into action at Hill 135.4. A battalion-sized Kampfgruppe from the 60th Motorised Division, including 15 tanks, also moved to the area and struck the 3rd Battalion from the 115th Rifle Regiment. At first, they didn't get very far, although Hill 135.4 does seem to have fallen to the Germans. But then, in the afternoon, they began to gain ground. The 3rd Battalion of the 115th Rifle Regiment, plus other elements, managed to hold the Germans just north of Orlovka. And as this played out, the 389th Infantry Division pushed northwards and crossed the Mechetka River, moving towards Orlovka. The 1st Battalion of the 124th Rifle Brigade was forced back slightly in the face of this onslaught, and at the same time forward elements of the 94th Infantry Division also joined the fight, striking towards Orlovka itself. They battled the 2nd Motorised Rifle Brigade, splitting the unit in 2, and compelled its 4th Battalion to fall back slightly to a hill in the area, where they reformed a defence line with the reinforcing 724th Regiment. The other 3 battalions of the 2nd Motorised Rifle Brigade withdrew towards Orlovka, and the 2nd Battalion from the 115th Rifle Regiment was hit from the south by elements of the 389th Infantry Division, compelling it to fall back as well. This resistance, though, by a handful of Soviet soldiers, actually impressed the Germans. You can't imagine how they're defending Stalingrad. Like dogs. So the Orlovka salient was in trouble, but the Germans couldn't advance any further on this day. To the south, Gorishny's 95th Rifle Division launched yet another attack against the Germans in the Mamiev-Kurgan area in the early morning. Massive airstrikes from the 8th Air Army bombed the 295th Infantry Division's positions as the 90th Regiment, reinforced by 2 battalions from the 1045th Regiment, almost took the crest of the burial mound. To their north, the Soviets also recaptured the shooting range village, which had fallen the previous day to Kampfgruppe Moor. But soon after this success, German artillery and Nebelwerfers fired, and the 100th Jaeger and 295th Infantry Divisions counterattacked. Providing a fiery backdrop, Luftwaffe aircraft pounded the factory district relentlessly, setting the tractor factory ablaze. Initially, the Croatian 1st Battalion combed through the buildings and streets south of the wide road that divided the Red October village, taking on Soviet anti-tank gun positions and concrete cupolas with the help of 2 Stugs. However, 2 of their 3 companies were redeployed to the other side of the wide street in the afternoon, and the attack continued on a wider front, assisted by Stukas, artillery and flamethrowers. Foerster's 1st Battalion also advanced on their northern flank, as the 2nd Battalion of the 227th Jaeger Regiment advanced to their south. The skirmishes in the streets were tough, with individuals charging into fortified houses, using grenades and rifle butts as Soviet snipers took their toll. Only 4 streets were cleared for significant losses. The day had once again proven costly for 100th Jaeger Division. 346 casualties. That brought its total losses in barely 3 days to over 1,200 men. Hauptmann Chorich was wounded, and because losses were so high, the decision was made to disband the 2nd Croatian Battalion, with the remnants being sent to reinforce the 1st Croatian Battalion. So, rather than a Croatian regiment, there was basically just 1 battalion left now. To their south, the 1047th and 1043rd Regiments held against the 518th and 517th Regiments in the areas of the Dolgi and Krutoe ravines. 71st Infantry Division also continued its fight with the 13th Guards Rifle Division in the city centre, although, by this point, the Soviets had fortified buildings and other positions around 9th of January Square, and the 194th Infantry Regiment of 71st Infantry Division was simply too weak to do much against them. So the fighting for the day came to an end. Overall, it had been a fairly disappointing advance for the Germans. 24th Panzer Division's gains during the day were only minimal, several hundreds of meters, at a cost of 39 killed, 94 wounded and 8 missing, the highest death toll to date. The 100th Jaeger Division reported 346 men killed or wounded. With Paulus's offensive running out of steam, the battle in the centre ground to a halt on the 30th of September 1942. This was fortunate for the Soviets as it gave them an opportunity to regroup. The 685th Regiment was pulled out of the line in 13th Guards Rifle Division's area and returned to the bulk of Shmekatorov's 193rd Rifle Division. In addition, the decision was made to withdraw the shattered 23rd Tank Corps from the field. Popov subordinated all of 23rd Tank Corps' tanks and soldiers into the 6th Guards Tank Brigade to consolidate their strength, but even by doing this, the 6th Guards Tank Brigade only had 21 tanks, 5 inoperable tanks, 268 men, 1 anti-tank gun, and a handful of artillery and mortars. So, one entire corps could now hardly call itself a brigade. After this, Popov and his headquarters were shipped across the Volga, along with the headquarters of the other brigades. On the other side of the wire, Seydlitz ordered his units to consolidate their positions, and Lenski did the same, although both did permit local advances to improve their positions. Edelsheim probed into the area south of the silicate factory, as the 100th Jaeger Division attacked east as well. Winterfeldt also prepared to strike towards the tractor factory village, but didn't make a move this day, and neither did the bulk of the 276th Infantry Regiment, which had only just entered the line. Pfeiffer continued to move elements of the 267th and 274th Regiments northwards to help deal with the Orlovka salient, and Yenneker's 389th Infantry Division did manage to push slightly further northeast along the bank of the Machetka River. So the Germans did have some reserves of energy left, even if it wasn't much. The Soviets actually managed to hold the line in the Orlovka salient though, with only a few positions falling to German hands. And there were, in fact, some reverses for the Germans. In the early afternoon, a Soviet counterattack retook the bathhouse and forced Foerster's battalion back to school number 20. This is an indication that Paulus's army was in trouble, confirmed again by the fact that the fighting at Mamiev Kurgan remained static, as was the situation in the city centre, and the 194th Regiment of 71st Infantry Division made absolutely no progress against 13th Guards Rifle Division's defences. There, only 3 to 4 city blocks from the Volga River's western bank, Rodimtsev created a virtually impregnable defence based on multiple platoon, company and battalion strongpoints scattered throughout the dense network of buildings north and south of 9th of January Square. So configured, his riflemen proved capable of parrying every blow delivered by Hartmann's grenadiers. Paulus's optimism in the previous days now seems to have turned to depression and worry. The Soviets were stubbornly resisting, were sending in plenty of reinforcements, something Paulus didn't have access to, and his weakening units meant that seemingly minor objectives, like the capture of locations like the Dolgi and Krutoy ravines or the Meat Combine, were beyond the capability of his units. It probably didn't help that the eyes of the whole world were on him. On the 30th of September 1942, Hitler gave a speech to his party in which he reminded everyone of his objectives in the East. The first goal was to take from the enemy the last great breadbasket. Second, to pull out from under him the last bit of coal that can be carbonized. To move up to his oil fields, either to take them or at least to shut him out of there. Fourth, the attack was to be continued in order to cut off his last great arterial road, the Volga. The objective was an area between the bend of the Don and the Volga, and the town of Stalingrad. Not because the town bears Stalin's name, which is unimportant, but exclusively because it is a strategically important area, and we were aware that the elimination of the Dnieper, the Don and the Volga as traffic routes would be as terrible or worse for the Soviet Union as it would be for Germany if we lost the Rhine, the Elbe, the Oder or the Danube. It, the Volga, has now been cut off for some time. Now it is the taking of Stalingrad, above all, that will be brought to a conclusion, whereby this log will gain in depth and strength. And you can rest assured that no human being can remove us from this place. Historians have long argued that Hitler shouldn't have made this promise, and this is something we'll come back to discuss in the future. What matters for now is that, just as Hitler made this promise, Chuikov was receiving fresh reinforcements. To the rear, overnight, from the 30th of September to the 1st of October, the 39th Guards Rifle Division and parts of the 308th Rifle Division crossed the Volga to reinforce Stalingrad. These were certainly not at full strength. In fact, they actually had less men than some of 62nd Army's rifle brigades, and Paulus's artillery, Pickett's flak guns and Fiebig's Stukas all fired at the boats as they crossed the water, causing even more casualties. But ultimately, these efforts did little more than delay the inevitable, and the two divisions got across. And they weren't the only ones. That same night, the 42nd and 92nd Rifle Brigades were ferried back across the Volga into the city, and elements of Batyuk's 284th Rifle Division, which hadn't crossed earlier, now also moved into the city. Captain Askinonov described what happened. We got to Stalingrad on September 30th, 1942. About 10 kilometers out, I could already see a massive wall of smoke, and the glow from the city was getting brighter as we approached. The entire city seemed to be on fire. We crossed the river at night. The barge we were crossing on got shelled by the Germans. As it happened, the rope connecting us to the tugboat broke, and while the tug went to shore for another rope, we were anchored in the middle of the river, with the Germans still shelling us. We had wounded men on the barge. Mortar shells were exploding close by. The Germans were launching flares that completely lit up the river, but there was nothing we could do. The Soviets weren't sending in unlimited amounts of reinforcements. The divisions and units that crossed the Volga this night were already depleted from their previous fights. However, it was more than what the Germans were receiving, which was nothing. time was rapidly running out for the Germans. If they wanted to take the city, they would have to do so now, or send in substantial reinforcements. Without those extra men, Paulus's only choice was to make a decisive move that would destroy a number of Soviet units, shorten his line, and reduce the threat of the Kotlebane operations to the north. His choice, therefore, was to destroy the Orlovka salient. But could he do it? The Soviets were resisting stubbornly in that area, so did he have the energy to pull it off? And would the destruction of the salient turn the tide of battle in his favour? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.